What lessons of the war in Ukraine do you think the U.S. has drawn on this, like a year later?
Well, I think the U.S. has learned a lot of lessons from this war. I think all sides have learned lessons, but the U.S. in particular has learned quite a few lessons and corrected some false impressions that I had prior. And we will continue learning lessons as this war unfolds and as more information comes forth. But the first that we've learned is that the Russian military and its many reforms that it's been conducting since 2008 have not produced the military that the Russian government had hoped, the Russian leadership had hoped. It's a military that's weaker than we thought in the West, certainly weaker than the Russians thought. We've also learned the lesson that the Ukrainian military is an outstanding military, has done far better than I think anyone outside of Ukraine anticipated. And this is a big lesson that a country like Ukraine with the right kinds of training and opportunities and the right resources can defend itself rather capably, especially against this Russian military. So those are two big military lessons learned up front.
Kevin, we're watching a number of events related to the anniversary, and we are seeing President Biden in Europe making his addresses to the European public and to the world, for that matter. And we know that Polish Prime Minister announced that Poland is talking now to the United States about increasing the U.S. troops' presence in Poland on the ground. Do you think that we can safely conclude that it is in preparation for some bigger steps that Washington is considering?
So I think that Washington is continuing to assess the situation there. We have slowly but steadily increased the kinds of weapons and resources that we've provided to Ukraine. And at the same time, we've taken steps with our Eastern European NATO partners by increasing our presence there, increasing the overall NATO presence there, especially in Poland, which is a very important ally in this fight. I'm not sure that these are precursors to some sort of major escalation by the United States or NATO, but certainly they are messages that we are prepared to escalate if the Russian side escalates and if an escalation is called for. But I wouldn't say that these are meant as messages that in the next several months the United States will greatly increase its military presence in one or the other countries. Certainly the administration has been clear about not putting American troops in Ukraine. I think that's going to remain.
That seems to be in line with the statement that President Biden just made meeting with the Central European partners, and he reiterated again that the U.S. will fight for every inch of the NATO territory. He was not talking about Ukraine. He was talking to the NATO members about the U.S. involvement in the defense of their lands. Do you think that this is more of a rhetorical message that is being sent to Moscow, or Washington is actually expecting Russia encroaching on the NATO territory?
I think I don't think there's information that Russia is planning to encroach or invade NATO territory. However, it's much more than just a rhetorical comment for the president to remind both the Russians, but also remind our allies and partners in NATO that the United States remains committed to the defense of those countries. Understandably, some of the countries that border Russia are nervous about the commitment that NATO has made on paper and is now reinforcing with its presence and resources and units military units that are being stationed in those countries. Nevertheless, a comment from the United States president goes a long way toward reassuring those partners and allies that these are not temporary measures. These are intended to be long-term commitments to these countries.
Kevin, you mentioned escalation, and General Milley recently said we have to be very, very conscious about managing escalation. At the same time, we have to uphold the principles for which the United Nations was founded and which the international order is resting on. Do you think that escalation management becomes an even more daunting task now that Russia suspended its participation in the START treaty?
Yeah, first, I agree with General Milley about the importance of managing this properly, but I also know that General Milley is aware, and I believe it's extremely risky and dangerous to believe that you can reliably control escalation when there's an active war going on. We're in a very dangerous situation now, and that's been made more dangerous by Russia's continued threats about nuclear weapons. Pulling out of the Strategic Nuclear Arms Control Agreement, the START agreement, makes this nuclear threat, it takes the nuclear threat beyond the local region, if you will, beyond the use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and puts it on the table as a strategic threat. This move by President Putin is not one that can be easily walked back, because he has set preconditions to returning to this treaty, which would be very difficult for the West to meet, specifically having France and United Kingdom become, as it were, members of this treaty, including their nuclear arsenals into the treaty. So this is a very escalatory step by President Putin. It's with a weapon that we're all worried about, which is the nuclear weapon, and it's something that's aimed directly at the West, at the United States.
Quoting General Milley some more, he once again reiterated, and he already mentioned that before, and we talked about it, that in his opinion, neither side is going to prevail militarily on the ground in Ukraine. Will this, first of all, is it common realization in Washington and in the United States, and will this be somehow altering the modus operandi of the United States in this war?
Well, I'm not sure that he said exactly that. I think he said that he thought it was unlikely or difficult to imagine that one side or the other would prevail with total victory. And with that, I agree 100%. I think most people recognize how difficult it would be for Ukraine, even if it had all the weapons that it wanted, to oust Russia from this land bridge region and Crimea. And at the same time, we recognize how difficult it will be for Russia to do anything better than what it's already done because of its overall lack of resources and its inability really to have properly prepared for this war. I'm not sure that we can predict, or that we're in a position really to predict what this war will look like in another 12 months. But we can certainly say that over the next 6 to 12 months, a lot of things will be clarified for us. Much like happened in the Korea War, much like happened in World War I, a lot of the maneuvering may have already happened in the first year of this war. And now we may be looking at chipping away at certain regions, certain parts of territory, trying to make the best situation from both sides.
Kevin, to what you said, the United States will be forced to rethink the level of its military spending and also the entire military theory of recent years due to military actions in Ukraine. This is another quote from General Milley. What do you think will this rethinking entail, and what practical steps will follow?
Well, certainly the United States military has a lot of combat experience, but that combat experience over the last 20 plus years was against adversaries which were not really peer competitors in that they didn't have the same kinds of tank and infantry units, the same kinds of aviation and drones and other long-range precision weapons that we had, that we brought to the fight. Today, we're seeing two rather evenly matched militaries with all of those capabilities, and we're seeing things that, well, maybe some people were aware that they would be part of this war, but I think the majority of people did not. The enormous expenditure of resources, ammunition, vehicles, and the necessity to mobilize large numbers of fighters well beyond what the structure was at the beginning of the war from both sides. Both sides started at some lower number of units and personnel, and now have mobilized hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. So these are things that the West, these are things that the United States in particular has to learn from and to take notice of.
The Army, the U.S. Army, is planning a 500% increase in artillery shell production from 15,000 a month to 70,000 a month, according to Army Acquisition Chief Doug Bush. This is reported by CNN. New military plant in Texas is being launched to meet the demands of the Ukrainians on the ground. And this is not even the war that the United States is directly fighting. Is it unprecedented from the historical perspective that the U.S. is boosting its production to military production to this extent?
Well, it's not unprecedented. Certainly, if we go back to the time before World War II, the United States began to ramp up its production of military munitions, equipment, aviation, ships. And at the time, we were sharing that new production and those resources with our allies and partners in Europe who were fighting a war that had begun in 1938. So in this regard, what we're doing is not a new idea. It certainly is unprecedented in the last 50, 70 years since World War II. So for that reason, we are relearning lessons, some of them the hard way.
Pentagon might need an increase in its budget due to this increase in production. Different sources report that. To what extent do you think the defense budget could be extendable now that it has reached its historic, unprecedented, if we can say, level that is being presented to the U.S. public now?
Right. Well, I think there's still room to increase funding to the United States military, to the defense budget. But certainly the Defense Department must take a hard look inside of itself and make cost-cutting a priority where it can, because the United States, the Defense Department, I know already recognizes they have to recognize the burden that this puts on the U.S. economy and on the U.S. budget. So I think we will see some cost-cutting, some cost-saving attempts by the Defense Department. But at the end, I think you're right that the number will go up. And I think this is important that we spend this money now when this war is happening. We have the enemy, we have the fighting going on, we have the enemy at the doorstep, and it's not a time for us to skimp on defense budgets now.
Kevin, the inspectors general responsible for monitoring the $110 billion in U.S. military and economic assistance to Ukraine said that it would be useful to send auditors directly to the war zone to increase monitoring of weapons transferred to Kyiv. This was reported by at least 3 inspectors general. Is it realistic in your mind to carry out such audits in war conditions, and what level of accuracy can one expect from such inspections?
Yeah, of course it's difficult when people are shooting at you to do something, but the point is well made by the auditors. I think it's important that the United States people feel confident that their resources, their donations, the aid that they're providing is being properly used, and auditors are critical to that assessment. So I fully anticipate that these auditors will be sent. I hope that they will be sent. And yes, it is risky, but it certainly is possible for them to be able to help track the delivery and the use of this material.
In the last 2 weeks, Kevin, it's been said multiple times that Russia seemed to have already started its offensive that we've talked about before. What do you see? What are you observing? And what is your assessment of the quality of this offensive?
Yeah, I think that this is a slow rolling start to an offensive rather than a blitzkrieg operation. The reason that it is a slow rolling start is because the Russian military learned in the first 12 months that they were not able to mount a blitzkrieg operation against the Ukrainian military. So we have to judge it this way now. We're not going to see lightning advances to take towns or to retake territory. We're going to see reports of gains or losses of a mile, or 2 miles, 5 miles at the most. Right now, the Russian military is, I would say, it's not having a lot of success against the Ukrainian military and the positions that are out there. But it's very early in this offensive to determine whether it ultimately will be successful or not. There are a lot of things that are in motion, the numbers of troops, all of this aid that we're promising that still needs to be delivered. And Russia itself is still training many of the troops that they mobilized last fall. So it's too early to say whether the Russians will be able to take back, let's say, Bakhmut and a large part of the Donetsk region, which they're still trying to fully capture. I have a lot of hope and belief that the Ukrainian military can prevent that, but we have to wait and see.
Kevin, with the supply of weapons, it's been a lot of discussions about how the tanks are being delivered to Ukraine, and there was a talk of the possibility of supplying military jets. And Ukrainian side keeps emphasizing that the time is of the essence. Western countries, in their own pace, are sending tanks. How would you characterize the dynamics, and how do you expect these weapons to be arriving to Ukraine? In time, too late, in the middle of the Russian offensive? What's your assessment?
So I think there is a consensus building. There's certainly pressure building to deliver, let's call this the last of the important weapon categories that the Ukrainians have been asking for, that the aircraft and as long-range artillery and rockets as we can get to them. We've already agreed to send tanks. So getting fighter aircraft, long-range aircraft into Ukraine is something the Ukrainian military has asked for all along. It appears that we're getting closer to providing that. I think that's a good thing. I don't think there's equipment that can come too late for the Ukrainians or too early. They certainly would like it sooner than later. But even if we were to make the decision today to get, say, F-16s or some other kinds of fighter aircraft into the hands of the Ukrainians, we all know that there's a training and a logistical delay associated with providing these new weapons. But certainly it would be better to start that process now than it would be to simply say, well, it's really too late for this war, this fight now. We should just hold off. No, we should do it now, even if it's just to better arm them for the ceasefire or the peace that might follow this war.
Kevin, is it true that training pilots for these fighter jets can take up to 3 years?
Well, this is the standard for Western air forces to train their fighter pilots. And certainly, if you take a young man off the streets in Kyiv and try to make him into a pilot, he's going to need a lot of time. I don't think that he needs 3 years, but he might take a year plus. But Ukraine also has pilots that are waiting for aircraft. And some of these people are trained to some degree already and understand the fundamentals of flying fighter aircraft. Their training would certainly not take 3 years. We say that, for example, it takes a year and a half to 2 years to train a Patriot soldier in the United States. But these weapon systems are made to basically run automatically with very little manpower, and with the computers doing most of the work. The training is necessary to ensure that you have the very best kind of people watching over these systems and able to repair them and to place them properly. But you don't need a year and a half to become a capable Patriot missileman or officer. You can do that in much less time.
Kevin, U.S. warned China against supplying arms to Russia. Beijing snapped back at Washington, saying that basically America can't order China around. What developments do you anticipate on that front, and how the U.S. can meaningfully prevent China from supplying arms to Russia? And is there such intention at all, do you think?
So I'm not in the loop as to what was told to China in the way of steps that the United States might take if China were to begin to send so-called lethal aid. Certainly, China is already supporting Russia in many ways in this war. And some of that aid is being used in weapon systems, electronics, and so on. So the line will be fuzzy between what they're giving now and what so-called lethal aid might be. But the United States has already made clear to China the kinds of steps that it might take if China were to provide more substantial lethal aid, ammunition, weapon systems, even fighters, although I think that would be the last thing that China would send. But I don't know what those steps were that the United States told to China, but I could imagine they might include much more severe sanctions, economic sanctions. There are a lot of technology and manufacturing things that the United States and China do together. They're intertwined. Some parts are built in America, some parts are built in China. So the U.S. has leverage, just as the Chinese have leverage over us. We have leverage over the Chinese too in those areas. So I expect that those would be the kinds of things that the United States would roll out if China were to cross that line.
Given we're watching military drills now, it's Russia, China, and South Africa participating. And one curious development of these drills was that it was announced that Russia will not be launching its well-advertised Zircon missile during these drills. And it was earlier reported that Russia first notified the U.S. of the test, and then it didn't happen. And the conclusion was made that it kind of failed the project and the launch. Do we know anything about that?
I really don't have a good answer for you there. Certainly with weapon systems that are new, that are still basically prototype weapon systems like the Zircon, you see continued failures throughout the testing and deployment. I think we just had a report that it's possible that one of the Sarmat missiles, the ICBM missiles, might have failed in a test launch. I don't know if that's true or not, but the United States has missile defenses which have failed testing at the same time that they're being deployed and that they are considered reliable for many missions that they might be assigned. So I don't attach a lot of importance to this report about a Zircon missile not working properly. I would say most of the new missiles that new systems that Putin announced back, I think in 2017, most of those are still prototypes, still being worked out. So those are those are weapons of the future. Really.
Do you see that Ukraine is becoming a test bed for all kinds of weapons there in Russia and all kinds of technologies overall that are being used on the battlefield?
Well, certainly the Russian leadership has said that publicly. Defense Minister Shoigu has said that the war, the special military operation, has given them an opportunity to test out everything from systems to planning and operations. And I think that it's fair to say that the West is also testing procedures, ideas, plans, systems that on the battlefield. So there's a lot of assessment going on both sides.
Is it true, Kevin, that it was reported, several sources said that the U.S. is now seeing the return to kind of conventional fight as opposed to conventional fighting of the 20th century, as opposed to was expected by different military strategic thinkers, anticipating more non-conventional clashes in the 21st century.
Right. Well, the movement or the recognition that we were entering a stage of great power competition again happened toward the end of our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And first, we saw it happen in terms of our political and our political assessment of the world stage. And because of that led to a reevaluation by the military, at least, and how it was set up to potentially fight a peer competitor, a great state power. And these are different kinds of militaries you need for these two different kinds of wars. And so I think the United States is on its way to doing that. We haven't fully gotten there yet, but we are making the right kinds of decisions about equipment and training and resources that will prepare us for this if, God help us, if that comes.